The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, the whole courtroom laughed. Not quiet laughter, not polite hand-over-mouth look-away laughter, but the full ugly head-thrown-back kind that comes from people who have been waiting a long time to see someone fall and have finally gotten their wish. Because when Mr. Harlan D.R.I., attorney at law of Burnt Ridge, Virginia, read aloud that Silas Crenshaw had left his only grandchild. Me, Nettie Crenshaw, age 15, currently of no fixed home and no living parents. The entirety of Lot 34, comprising 30 acres of ridgetop land east of Sutter's Gap, including all mineral and water rights therein. Every farmer, shopkeeper, and church-going citizen in that room knew exactly what my grandfather had done. He had left me a joke. Lot 34 was famous in Burnt Ridge the way a bad dog is famous. Everyone knew it, and nobody wanted it. 30 acres of limestone ridge so rocky that even the goats wouldn't graze it. The soil, what little existed, was a thin crust over solid bedrock, barely enough to grow lichen. My grandfather had bought it in 1919 for $12, a price that was itself a joke, and had spent the next 20 years being mocked for it. Silas Crenshaw's rock garden. They called it the 30-acre tombstone. When he died in the winter of 1941, alone in his cabin at the base of the ridge, people said the only thing he'd ever successfully raised on that land was dust. I was standing in the back of the courtroom in a dress I'd borrowed from the minister's wife because I didn't own one. My mother had died of pneumonia when I was 11. My father, Silas's son, had been killed in a logging accident 2 years later. Since then, I'd been passed around the valley like a stray cat nobody wanted to feed, but nobody was quite cold enough to drown. 3 months with Uncle Vernon, who drank, 2 months with the Petersons, who needed a girl to mind their younger children, but didn't need an opinion from that girl about anything. 6 weeks with the widow Ames, who found my habit of reading by candlelight disturbing and wasteful, and most recently 4 months with the Bakers, who told me on the morning of the will reading that I shouldn't bother coming back because they'd given my cot to a cousin's boy who was more useful. So I stood there in that borrowed dress, 15 years old, orphaned, homeless, and now the proud owner of 30 acres of rock that not a single person in Sutter Valley would have taken as a gift. If you want to find out what I discovered on that worthless land and how those same laughing people came to my door on their knees when the worst drought in 50 years turned their green farms to dust, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what those 30 acres of rock were hiding underneath is a story that changed the entire valley forever. I moved onto the land the next day because I had nowhere else to go. My grandfather's cabin sat at the bottom of the ridge where the rock met a thin strip of clay soil. Just enough flat ground for a one-room structure with a porch, a woodshed, and the remains of what had once been an ambitious vegetable garden, now gone to thistle and wild onion. The cabin was rough but solid. My grandfather had been a better builder than farmer. The roof was tight. The walls were chinked with care. And the wood stove, a cast iron beauty he'd salvaged from a schoolhouse demolition, still drew like a dream. There were worse places to be alone in the mountains of Virginia in early March. Not many, but some. Inside, I found what I expected. The sparse possessions of a man who had lived alone for a decade. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of canned goods, a Bible, and a rifle I didn't know how to use. But I also found what I didn't expect. Books. Stacks and stacks of them piled on the floor, wedged under the bed, filling a homemade shelf that ran the entire length of the back wall. Books on geology, on hydrology, on limestone formations and karst topography and underground river systems. Books with titles like The Movement of Water Through Porous Rock and Subterranean Streams of the Appalachian Region and a field guide to springs, seeps, and aquifers of the Blue Ridge Province. My grandfather, it turned out, had not been farming those 30 acres. He had been studying them. I found his notebooks on the second day in a tin box under the floorboards. 14 notebooks, each one filled cover to cover in his careful angular handwriting. They were organized by year from 1920 to 1940. And they told a story that nobody in Burnt Ridge had ever bothered to learn because nobody in Burnt Ridge had ever bothered to ask. Silas Crenshaw believed there was water under his rock. Not just a trickle, not a seep, an aquifer. A massive underground reservoir fed by the entire eastern face of Briar Mountain, channeled through limestone fractures over thousands of years into a natural cistern beneath the ridge. He had spent 20 years mapping the surface signs, patches of moss that stayed green in drought, certain trees whose roots dove deep enough to tap the moisture below, fractures in the limestone where cold air breathed out on summer mornings, and most importantly, a series of sinkholes along the ridge's spine that he believed were collapsed access points to the cavern system below. He had never found the water. He had come close. His final notebooks were increasingly excited, focused on one particular sinkhole near the ridge's eastern edge, where the temperature readings and moisture level suggested the aquifer surface was no more than 40 feet below grade. But his health had failed him. The winter of 1940 had broken something in his chest, and by the following January, he was gone. I sat on his cabin floor surrounded by those notebooks, and I understood two things with absolute clarity. First, my grandfather was not a fool. He was a scientist, a careful and methodical observer who had spent 2 decades gathering evidence for a theory that nobody wanted to hear because it came from a poor man who owned bad land. And second, I was going to find his water. The first months were about survival, not discovery. I need to be honest about this because the stories people tell later always skip the ugly parts, the desperate parts, the parts where you lie awake at 3 o'clock in the morning wondering if you'll be alive by spring. I had almost no money. The small amount left in my grandfather's estate after the lawyer's fees wouldn't last a month. The canned goods in the cabin got me through March. But by April, I was hungry in a way that sharpened everything. My eyesight, my hearing, my ability to identify edible plants, and my absolute refusal to walk back down to Burnt Ridge and ask anyone for help. The ridge, rocky as it was, wasn't lifeless. My grandfather's books had taught me to see what others missed. Between the limestone outcrops in crevices and pockets where soil had accumulated over centuries, there was life. Wild ramps in the shaded hollows chickweed and wood sorrel along the north face. A stand of black walnut trees at the ridge's western end. Their nuts still scattered on the ground from last autumn. A patch of wild blackberry canes that promised summer fruit. And in the thin strip of clay soil near the cabin, I planted a garden, small, desperate, stubborn, using seeds I'd bought with my last $1.50 at the hardware store in Burnt Ridge, where the owner, Mr. Goss, had looked at me with something between pity and contempt. "You planning to farm rock, girl?" he'd asked. "I'm planning to eat," I'd said. The garden struggled. The soil was poor. I hauled leaf litter from the forest floor to build it up, carried buckets of water from a tiny seepring a/4 mile below the cabin, composted every scrap of vegetable matter I could find. It was nothing like the farms in the valley below. Those rich bottomland fields with their deep black soil and reliable wells that had been watered by generations. My garden was a fistful of green in an ocean of gray stone. But it was mine, and it kept me alive through that first spring and into summer. Meanwhile, I read every one of my grandfather's books cover to cover. His notebooks from first page to last. Then again, I taught myself geology from a textbook so old the binding crumbled in my hands. I learned what limestone was. An ancient seabed compressed into rock over millions of years, riddled with fractures and caves carved by acidic rainwater dissolving the stone over millennia. I learned what a karst landscape was. Terrain shaped by dissolving rock characterized by sinkholes, caves, and underground drainage. And I learned what an aquifer was. A body of permeable rock that could hold and transmit groundwater like a giant underground sponge. My grandfather had believed the entire ridge was sitting on top of one. And the more I walked the land with his notebooks in my hand, matching his observations to what I could see and feel, the more I believed it too. I found the first real sign in July. There was a sinkhole my grandfather had marked as number 7, a depression about 12 feet across near the eastern edge of the ridge. He had noted that the temperature at the bottom was consistently cooler than the surface, sometimes by 15 degrees on hot days, and that maiden hair fern grew there, a plant that needs constant moisture. I cleared the debris. 3 days of hauling rocks by hand, filling buckets, carrying them to the edge. By the time I reached the bottom, my hands were raw. But what I found made me forget all of it. Beneath the compacted clay and rubble, there was a crack in the bedrock, a fracture about 2 feet wide, running north to south. And from that crack, cold air was rising. Not a breeze, something deeper, like the earth breathing. I held my hand over it, and the air was damp and smelled of wet stone and something ancient. I dropped a pebble and counted. 1, 2, 3, and then a faint distant plop. Water 3 seconds below me. I sat at the edge of that sinkhole and I cried. Not from grief, from the sharp joy of knowing my grandfather had been right. That 20 years of study and mockery had not been for nothing. That underneath 30 acres of rock that people used as a punchline, there was water. And in a valley that depended on shallow wells and seasonal creeks, water was everything. Finding the water and reaching it were 2 very different problems. I was a 15-year-old girl with no money, no equipment, and no one willing to help. But I had my grandfather's notebooks. And in Notebook 12, dated June 1938, I found a passage that changed everything. Number 7 is not the deepest access point. The eastern face of the ridge shows evidence of a much older collapse, a resurgence zone. If water enters the ridge through fractures above and collects in the cavern below, it must exit somewhere. The laws of physics demand it. I believe the exit point was sealed by a rock slide, perhaps centuries ago. If the resurgence could be cleared, the water would flow of its own accord. No drilling required. Gravity and pressure would do the work. A natural spring blocked by a collapse. I spent the rest of summer mapping the eastern face, following my grandfather's notes. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. A line of taller, greener trees tapping residual moisture. A bowl-shaped depression filled with rubble, too uniform to be natural. And at the center, buried under decades of leaves and vines, a jumble of massive limestone blocks bearing the marks of collapse. Fractured edges, displaced angles, the chaotic geometry of a shelf that had given way. I started digging in September. It was brutal work. I won't pretend otherwise. I moved rocks by hand. The smaller ones I carried. The larger ones I levered with a timber pole my grandfather had left in the woodshed, rolling them downhill inch by inch. I dug clay and gravel with the pickaxe until my palms blistered, popped, bled, and calloused over into something that didn't feel like a girl's hands anymore. I worked from first light until dark every day, fueled by garden vegetables, wild food, and a stubbornness that frightened even me. The first person to notice what I was doing was old Harlan Jessup. Harlan was 71 years old, a retired stonemason who lived in a shack about a mile down the valley from the base of my ridge. He was the kind of man the mountains produce in small quantities, quiet, self-sufficient, largely forgotten by a community that had moved past him. He'd known my grandfather. They'd played checkers on Silas's porch on Sunday afternoons, and Harlan was the only person I ever heard speak of my grandfather without mockery. He appeared at the edge of my excavation one October morning, leaning on a walking stick, watching me lever a boulder that outweighed me by a factor of 3. "Your granddaddy talked about this," he said, as if continuing a conversation we'd been having for years. "Said there was a spring sealed up in this hill." "There is," I said, not stopping my work. Most people thought he was crazy. Most people are wrong about most things. Harlan watched me work for another 10 minutes. Then he set down his walking stick, took off his jacket, and picked up the second timber pole. "My back's bad," he said, "but my arms still work." He came every day after that. We worked together through the autumn, clearing rubble, digging deeper into the hillside. Harlan knew stone in a way that I knew books instinctively, physically, with an understanding that went beyond words. He could look at a limestone block and tell me where it had fractured, how long ago, what forces had moved it. He taught me to read the rock the way my grandfather's books had taught me to read the landscape. And slowly, methodically, we dug our way into the sealed hillside. We found the passage in late November, 2 days before Thanksgiving. It was a Tuesday. The air was sharp with the promise of the first hard frost. I was working at the deepest point of our excavation. We'd cleared about 15 feet into the hillside by then, following a natural channel in the rock that Harlan said was unmistakably water-carved. When my pickaxe punched through into emptiness. Not rock, not clay, air. Cold, wet, rushing air that hit my face like opening a door into winter. I pulled back the pickaxe and put my eye to the hole. Darkness. But I could hear something. A sound so quiet and so constant that at first I thought it was my own blood in my ears. It was water. Moving water. Somewhere in that darkness, a stream was flowing. "Harlan," I whispered. My voice was shaking. "Harlan, come here." He knelt beside me and listened. His eyes, pale and watery with age, went wide. Then they filled with tears. He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed so hard it hurt. "Your granddaddy," he said. "Lord God, girl, your granddaddy was right." It took us another 2 weeks to widen the opening enough to enter. The passage opened into a cavern roughly the size of a church sanctuary, 60 feet long and 30 wide, with an arched ceiling glistening with moisture. And along the floor, emerging from a crack in the far wall and flowing in a channel it had carved over centuries, was a stream of the clearest, coldest water I had ever seen, 2 feet wide, 6 in deep, flowing with the unhurried patience of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years. I cupped my hands and drank. The water was sweet and cold, so cold it made my teeth ache and tasted of limestone and clean darkness. Harlan drank too, and sat back against the cavern wall and laughed the way children laugh. As I explored with the lantern, I realized the full scope of what my grandfather had theorized. This wasn't just a spring. The cavern was a junction point where multiple fractures converged, channeling water from the entire mountain into this underground reservoir. The stream was merely the overflow. Evidence of a water table that extended far beneath us, saturating the porous rock with millions of gallons, 30 acres of rock, and beneath it, an ocean. The question was how to bring the water to the surface. Harlan saw the solution immediately. "We don't need to pump it," he said. "The water's under pressure from the mountain. All we need is a channel cut through the lower wall, angled to the surface. It'll flow on its own, like an artesian well, but natural." It took us all winter. We chiseled a channel through the cavern's lower wall, following a natural fracture. By February, the channel was 12 feet long. By March 20th, and on the morning of March 22, 1942, exactly 1 year after I'd stood in that courtroom listening to laughter, Harlan's chisel broke through the last wall of rock and water came. Not a trickle, a flow, a steady crystalline stream that poured out of the hillside like the mountain had been holding its breath for centuries. It ran down the slope in a channel we'd prepared, pulled in a basin Harlan had built from stacked stone, and overflowed into a creek bed that hadn't held water in living memory. I stood in that cold March morning with water running over my boots, and I said to no one to the sky, to my grandfather, "I found it. I found your water." The first year nobody cared. The valley had its own wells. The creeks ran full from spring snow melt. People in Burnt Ridge had water and therefore had no reason to think about mine. I was still the Crenshaw girl, the strange one, the orphan living alone on 30 acres of rock with an old man for company. The spring was a curiosity at best. A few people hiked up to see it and went away shaking their heads, impressed maybe, but not enough to change their opinion of me or my land. I used the water to transform the ridge. With a reliable source, I built an irrigation system, stone channels, and clay pipes that Heron helped me lay across the thin soil near the cabin. I terraced the slopes with stacked limestone, filled the terraces with composted leaf litter, and planted fruit trees, berry bushes, herbs, and vegetables. The water changed everything. Soil that had been dust became dark and alive. By 1943, my ridge farm was producing more per acre than half the bottomland farms in the valley. The secret was the water. Constant, clean, mineral-rich water from the limestone aquifer that never slowed, never stopped. While other farmers depended on rain and shallow wells, my spring poured at the same rate whether it was July or January. Harlan and I built a spring house over the collection basin where the water's cold temperature kept milk fresh and butter solid. We built a pond stocked with trout and a stone trough for the small dairy goat herd I eventually acquired. The ridge was becoming something nobody had imagined, and I was becoming someone nobody had expected. Then came the summer of 1944. It started dry in May. By June, the creeks were low. By July, they were gone. The valley baked under a relentless sun. Farmers watched their corn curl and brown. Wells that had been reliable for 50 years dropped to mud, then to nothing. The Great Drought of 1944 was the worst Sutter Valley had seen since 1893. And it came when every young man was overseas, and every family was already stretched thin by rationing. The valley's wells went dry one by one. The Petersons' well went first. The Bakers followed a week later. Even the town well in Burnt Ridge dropped so low that water was rationed to 2 buckets per family per day. And on my ridge, the spring kept flowing. The aquifer didn't care about the drought. It was fed by decades of accumulated rainwater stored in millions of tons of porous limestone insulated by 40 feet of solid rock. The drought was a surface problem. My water came from deeper. The first person to come was Mrs. Peterson. She arrived at the base of my ridge on a Tuesday morning in August carrying 2 empty buckets and her youngest child on her hip. She didn't look at me. She looked at the ground. She asked if she could fill her buckets from my spring. "Yes," I said. I didn't make her beg. I didn't remind her that she had turned me out of her house. I didn't say a single word about the courtroom or the laughter or the months I had spent hungry and alone. I just said yes. She came back the next day with her neighbor. The day after that, 6 families came. By the end of the week, there was a line. I want to be clear about something. I could have charged them. Water in a drought is worth more than gold. I could have named any price and they would have paid because the alternative was watching their children go thirsty. Some people would have charged. Some would have called it justice. I gave it away, every drop. I set up a filling station at the basin and let anyone come any time and take what they needed. I asked nothing in return. I gave water to the bakers who had put me out of their house. I gave water to Mr. Goss who had sneered at me. I gave water to families from the far end of the valley who had heard about the girl on the rock ridge with the spring that never dried. Harlan asked me once why I did it. We were sitting on the porch watching people wind down the ridge path with their full buckets. They don't deserve it, you know, he said. Maybe not, I said. But the water doesn't know that. It just flows. And I think that's the right way to be. The drought lasted until October. By then, my spring had become the lifeline of the entire valley. Families who had lost everything. Crops, gardens, livestock survived because of water that came from 30 acres of rock that nobody had wanted. The town council in Burnt Ridge, humbled and desperate, formally requested permission to lay a pipe from my spring to the town cistern. I granted it. I signed the easement for $1 and asked only that the water remain free to anyone who needed it. Mr. Goss came to see me after the rains finally returned. He stood on my porch with his hat in his hands, a gesture I'd never seen from him, and he said, "Your grandfather tried to tell us. He tried to tell us for 20 years, and we laughed at him." "I'm sorry, Nettie. I'm sorry we laughed at you too. My grandfather didn't need you to believe him," I said. He believed himself. That was enough. But the truth is, it meant something to hear it. Not everything. Not enough to undo the years of loneliness and hunger and being treated like I was less than nothing. But something, a small clean thing, like the first sip of water from a spring you've spent a year digging for. Ruth and Calloway, the county school teacher who had started visiting my ridge out of curiosity, helped me organize my grandfather's 14 notebooks and send them to the State Geological Survey. A team came out the following spring. They tested the water, mapped the cavern, measured the flow rate, and confirmed what Silas Crenshaw had theorized. The aquifer beneath my ridge was one of the largest undocumented freshwater reserves in the Blue Ridge province. The head geologist, Dr. Amos Whitfield, read my grandfather's notebooks and shook his head in something like sorrow. This man was doing real science, he said, self-taught, working with almost no resources, and he got it right. Nobody listens to poor men with bad land, I said. Dr. Whitfield published a paper crediting Silas Crenshaw as the aquifer's discoverer. It was the first time my grandfather's name appeared in print without a joke attached to it. I married in 1947. His name was Daniel Morse, a quiet teacher from the next county who wandered up to my ridge one Saturday to see the famous spring. He was the kind of man who listened more than he talked and who understood without being told that when I showed him my grandfather's notebooks, I was showing him the most valuable thing I owned. We had 4 children on that ridge. We expanded the farm until every terrace produced, until the orchards were heavy with fruit, until the spring house was full of cheese and butter from our dairy goats. In 1953, Daniel rigged a small hydroelectric generator using the stream's steady flow to power lights in the cabin and the barn. Harlan died in the winter of 1949 at 79. I buried him on the ridge near the cavern entrance under a stone I carved myself. He knew what the rock was worth. My children grew up calling that spot Harlan's Rest. The Burnt Ridge Water Cooperative was established in 1955 with my spring as its primary source. I served on the board but refused to be chairwoman. The cooperative laid pipes throughout the valley, ensuring every household had clean water regardless of ability to pay. The drought of 1944 had taught the valley a lesson it never forgot. Water is not a commodity. It is a commons. By the 1960s, the ridge that had been a punchline was a landmark. School groups toured the cavern. University students studied the aquifer. I taught everyone the same lesson my grandfather's notebooks had taught me. Look deeper. The surface tells you almost nothing. I wrote a book in 1970, The Water Beneath the Rock. A granddaughter's account of Silas Crenshaw's discovery published by the State University Press. It wasn't a bestseller. It was meant to put my grandfather's name on a cover and his work between proper bindings. I lived on that ridge for the rest of my life. I watched my children grow and leave and come back with children of their own. I watched the valley change around me. New roads, new houses, new faces. But the spring never changed. It poured out of the hillside at the same steady rate, year after year, decade after decade, as patient and reliable as the rocket flowed through. Daniel passed in 1978 on the porch in the evening, watching the sun drop behind Briar Mountain. I sat beside him and held his remaining warmth until the stars came out and the spring's murmur was the only sound in the hollow. I buried him next to Harland on the ridge where the water sang beneath the stone. I kept working. My hands were stiff by then. My knees protested every terrace, but the ridge was in my blood and the work was in my bones. In 1981, the state of Virginia designated the Crenshaw Aquifer as a protected natural resource. In 1983, the Geological Society of Virginia posthumously awarded my grandfather the Harlan Citation for significant contributions to the understanding of karst hydrology. I accepted the award on his behalf, standing in a room full of scientists and officials, wearing the same plain dress I always wore. And I said, Silas Crenshaw didn't need this award. He needed one person to listen. I'm glad I was that person. I died on a spring morning in 1985 at the age of 59, younger than I would have liked. But the years on the ridge had been hard years, honest years, years that used a body completely. They found me in the garden, kneeling beside the terrace wall, my hands in the soil, the spring running clear and cold just 20 feet away. My daughter said it looked like I'd simply stopped to rest and decided to stay. The spring is still flowing. It has never stopped. Not in drought, not in flood, not in the hardest winters or the hottest summers. The Shaw Ridge Farm is operated now by my granddaughter, who has my grandfather's eyes and my stubbornness, and her father's gentle way with words. The cavern is open to visitors. The aquifer still supplies water to the valley. And on the wall of the spring house, carved in limestone by Harlan Jessup's steady hand in 1943, there is a single sentence that says, "Everything I ever learned about life. What they call worthless, they simply haven't looked beneath." So, I want to ask you something. What have people told you is worthless about you? What 30 acres of rock are you sitting on? What inheritance of struggle? What legacy of things that look like nothing that you haven't dug into yet? What's flowing beneath the surface of your life that you haven't found because everyone around you told you there was nothing there? Because here's what I know. The people who laugh are always the people who haven't dug. They see the surface, the rock, the poverty, the borrowed dress, the orphan standing alone in the back of the courtroom. And they think they see everything. They don't. They never do. The surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land and of any human being. Dig deeper. The water is there. It's always been there. It's been waiting for someone stubborn enough, patient enough, and brave enough to ignore the laughter and start moving rocks. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that the things people mock are often the things that matter most, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who uncovered extraordinary things in the places everyone else had given up on. Your 30 acres of rock are not a joke. They're a beginning. Start digging.